Gentleman's time's expired. Chair recognizes Mr. Casar for Texas.
Thank you. The 20-year Afghanistan war caused extraordinary death and devastation for the Afghan people and for American troops, killing, by some estimates, over 70,000 civilians and 2,400 American service members. And we still have so many constituents and friends here in the United States suffering, even if they survive the war. It's really important that the Biden administration ended the longest war in the history of our nation. Not only was it an important thing to do, I believe it was the right thing to do. No other president was able to do that in 20 years with bipartisan support from folks on this committee. But almost 2 years later, in addition to living under a repressive and autocratic Taliban regime, over half the Afghan population is on the brink of starvation, in part because of actions taken by the U.S. when we froze Afghanistan's central bank assets, resulting in a liquidity crisis. That means that normal people aren't able to access their money. Human rights groups have warned that 70% of Afghans are unable to meet their basic needs, including food, and more civilians could die from this financial crisis in the country than during the 20 years of war. Afghan feminist activists have pointed out that the economic collapse caused in part by the asset freeze overwhelmingly devastates the lives of Afghan women and girls. Mr. Sopko's report just came out this morning detailing the Biden administration creating the Afghan Fund to disperse $3.5 billion of people's frozen assets back into Afghanistan, and creating liquidity for folks to make sure that kids have shoes on their feet and food in their bellies and farmers can produce, that folks can live. But also the report details the risks associated with making sure those funds don't fund terrorism and that there isn't money laundering. But we have to fix this problem. People shouldn't starve for humanitarian reasons, but also folks starving pushes them further into the hands of their oppressors, and we don't want the money going to funding terrorism. So how are we going to solve this problem urgently and quickly? To whoever can respond.
Well, you've hit it on the head, Congressman. I mean, the dilemma we have is if we don't, and we're giving most of the assistance, humanitarian assistance to Afghanistan, of all the countries combined. If we stop that assistance, millions will starve. Unfortunately, and this is the difficult thing is we don't have the adequate oversight to prevent the money from going to the Taliban or other nefarious groups. I think as IGs, we say do better oversight if you make that policy decision on continuing funding. There's a further dilemma which you've touched upon, and that is the way the Afghans are treating over 50% of their population. Basically, if you're a woman in Afghanistan, you're in a prison. And this is the thing I think one of the congressmen was hitting on. By not allowing women to work for the UN or for NGOs, that means poor women who are starving to death cannot go to get food because they can't travel in that country unless they have a male companion. They can't go to an office run by the UN unless there's a woman there.
And Mr. Sopko, I don't mean to cut you off.
Yeah,
it's really serious, but the humanitarian assistance is critical, as we've laid out.
It is critical.
But figuring out the macroeconomic situation is critical so that folks can sustain themselves. It's a real problem. What are we going to do? And it's been almost 2 years. What do we think here amongst us we could do to solve the fact that folks can't go to the bank and get access to their money?
Well, right now, we can't give that money, and I don't think the State Department or the Treasury wants that money to go to the central bank, because the central bank is basically not an independent bank. So this is a very difficult thing, and that's what we're just alerting to you. It's a good idea.
I hear you, and I hear that there's problems. My question is, what are we going to do about it? The world is real rough, and in Afghanistan, it's way worse than that. So what are we going to do? And Ms. Shaw, if you have a 15-second answer, that'd be great before my time expires.
Sure. I would just say, as it's been said before, we don't decide the policy, but when that funding is given, our work does show that there are improvements that can be made to the monitoring and oversight of those funds to provide the sorts of assurances that you're talking about. And our investigative work can also look at situations and allegations of potential fraud, diversion, and mismanagement. So there are mechanisms that can be used to better safeguard. It may not be perfect. It can't guarantee no dollar dollars will go into the wrong hands, but in terms of balancing those competing interests, that's what our work has been able to show.
Well, we denounce the Taliban as we should, but when the U.S. contributes to the suffering of everyday people, that pushes the population further into the hands of their oppressors. So if we want to make Afghans and Americans safer, if we want to take on the Taliban, we should focus on feeding and clothing people, not starving them, and we should solve this problem. Thank you.